Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Edwin M. Lamboy, and I'm the Interim Dean of the City College of New York School of Education. Today's event marks the official kickoff of our year-long Centennial celebration. The theme of this celebration, Educating for Democracy in a Diverse World, captures our past, present, and future commitment to educate teachers and school leaders who are prepared to change the lives of all children in our city, in our country, and around the world. So how did it all begin? The history of the School of Education starts in 1901 as a collection of 5 pedagogy elective courses offered by the philosophy department. 5 years later, the Department of Education, which by then offered 7 courses, was created. By 1916, there were over 100 students specializing in education with a view to becoming teachers. And by 1920, courses for the preparation of teachers offered by the Division of Extension were the first and largest vocational training undertaken by the City College. Finally, in 1921, the School of Education is established with Paul Clapper as dean. There were 9 faculty members in the school, and it offered 12 courses in areas such as kindergarten and preschool and leadership. The School of Education has enjoyed numerous milestones, and I'd like to share some with you. In 1907, while it was still the Department of Education, it initiates the first degree granting evening program in the nation. In 1916, the college's charter is changed to award education degrees to female students. In the late 1930s, Dr. Max Yergan, a full-time African-American faculty member in the history department and the School of Education, develops and teaches a course entitled Negro History and Culture. In the early 1950s, the School of Education offers for the first time a course entitled The Teacher in the Community, Meeting the Needs of Children of Puerto Rican Descent. In 1972, Lillian Weber receives a grant to open a workshop center with the goal of supporting individualized instruction and open classroom teachers. In 1984, the School of Education moves into our beloved NAC building. And in 1904, we achieved national accreditation through the National Council for Accreditation of Teacher Education. In recent years, several CCNY education programs have been recognized nationwide. For example, last year, the Hispanic Outlook in Education magazine ranked CCNY's bilingual education program as the 6th best bilingual, multilingual, and multicultural education degree in the nation. Also, our early childhood education undergraduate program, housed at the Center for Worker Education, was ranked number 4 in the United States among the top 85 most affordable programs by Discovery Early Childhood EDU. Moreover, in their 2020 ranking of best colleges for earning potential, grad reports placed our special education and educational leadership programs in the top 10 in the United States. And just 2 weeks ago, Intelligent.com ranked our educational theater program among the top 50 masters in K-12 education degree programs in the nation. To date, the CCNY School of Education has prepared thousands of teachers and school leaders who have made and continue to make a difference in the lives of the New York City's children and youth, and who value, appreciate, and learn from the diversity that characterizes and energizes our city. In this group of accomplished alumni, we have Susan Gabar, author and educator, Norma Feshbach, clinical psychologist and professor of education, Joyce Coppin, former president of the New York City Association of Superintendents, and Betty Rosa, New York State Education Department Commissioner. These teachers and leaders embody the mission of the CCNY School of Education, which is to prepare knowledgeable, reflective, and caring educators who are qualified and committed to teaching and leading diverse communities. We have many distinguished guests among us today, including some of our former deans, Jim Newyar, Al Posamentier, Doris Cintron, Mary Driscoll, and Gretchen Johnson, as well as former colleagues and alumni. We are honored with your presence here today. And now I would like to introduce you to Felix Martos Rodriguez, Chancellor of the City University of New York.
Thank you. Muchísimas gracias, Dean Lamboy, for that kind introduction, and congratulations to the Dean and to all the faculty and the students and alumni of the City College School of Education who represent 100 years at the forefront of public education here in New York City. Thank you also to President Boudreau for inviting me to join this wonderful celebration of the Schools of Education Centennial. I'm grateful for the support you have carried on for the school and its mission. I'm also happy to be joined by Dr. Ashley Thompson, our extremely dedicated and hardworking University Dean for Education, and also by Dr. Beverly Falk, the Director of the school's graduate programs in early childhood education. Also, a shout out to former Dean Doris Intron, now serving as the interim president at Gutman Community College. I'm also delighted to welcome your keynote speaker, Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond, who has devoted her career to making American education more inclusive and equitable. As Dean Lamboy mentioned, the school was established in 1921, but its conception as a trailblazer of public education in New York City dates back 2 decades earlier. And you will allow me to play the historian a little bit. When the college Department of Philosophy introduced 2 courses in the history and principles of education and began a 3-year program for students who intended to teach. 3 years later, CCNY introduced a 3-year course in pedagogy that included logic, psychology, and teaching methods. The first dean of the School of Education was Professor Paul Clapper, a 1904 CCNY graduate who served for 15 years before becoming the first president of Queens College. So Dr. Clapper and I have a connection. And I used to look from my office when I was the president of Queens College to a building that had his name as the founding president of our college, of Queens College. City College and its School of Education are in many ways the spiritual birthplace of our university's critical role in public education in this city. Cuny has long been the main pipeline for teachers in New York City. In New York City's public classrooms, we educate the educators. And you heard that long list of distinguished alumni that was shared with you by Dean Lamboy. Education is today the largest single academic area CUNY-wide. We enroll more than 18,000 students in 500 academic programs. We produce more than 20% of the teaching graduates in all of New York State, and very significantly, nearly 40% of the state's teachers of color. The newly appointed chancellor of the city's Department of Education, Misha Porter, is a product of CUNY's Hunter College, although she was not originally an education major. All of that wonderful CUNY tradition started here with the CCNY School of Education. In recent years, we have been increasingly focused on diversity and equity in education and how closely that connects to opportunities for social and economic mobility, not only for our education graduates, but ultimately for the children they go on to teach. Now, more than ever, we need a diverse teacher workforce. The city's children need teachers who come from their communities, who can be role models and mentors. Educators who bring the kind of commitment and resolve that so many of our city's teachers have shown in the face of the incredible challenges of the past year. The CCNY School of Education has exemplified this mission since its inception. Today, the school prepares future teachers and future school leaders to work in high-need public schools with diverse populations of students. Its alumni see diversity in all its manifestations as an asset, something that enriches their practice as well as the lives and learning experiences of their students. Many CCNY education students are first-generation college students and members of disenfranchised groups who go back to their communities to serve as teachers and school leaders, helping children and their parents better themselves. This makes the CCNY School of Education a key player in the health and future of our beloved New York City. I am very connected personally to the mission of this school and share your passion for teaching and public education. I have been blessed and have been inspired by so many teachers in my life, starting with my own abuela, my grandmother, Margarita Castro, who was a public school English teacher in Puerto Rico for 40 years. That's the priceless thing that comes with being a teacher. The power to inspire, the chance to help the next generation reach higher, the endless possibilities for changing lives. That's what the City College School of Education has been all about for the past 10 years. It is a remarkable legacy and one that I know you're building on every day. Have a wonderful celebration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Felix Martos Rodriguez. It's an honor to have you here. And now I'd like to introduce Ashley Thompson, the Cuny Dean for Education. Dr. Thompson.
Good evening. I'm Ashley Thompson, University Dean for Education at the City University of New York, and I have the privilege of supporting teacher preparation across Cuny. I'm so excited to share in this milestone for City College of New York School of Education. I would like to thank Dean Lamboy for the invitation to speak, acknowledge the leadership of our Chancellor and President Boudreau, and join in welcoming our distinguished guests, colleagues, and the faculty who embody the core of our schools of education. Most importantly, I would like to celebrate the students and graduates, past and present. Through my own experience with CCNY's Education Alumni Affiliate, I'm impressed and inspired by their engagement with important issues, their respect for one another, and their agency as educators. Coming together to hear from Linda Darling-Hammond, one of the most influential contemporary voices in the field of education, is an experience befitting this momentous centennial. Cuny plays a significant role in the educational system here in New York City. We're at the forefront of responding to critical needs in the city's schools. As we strive to offer innovative and high-quality teacher preparation programs, we do so rooted in the knowledge that the teachers we prepare and support will shape public education in New York City. And in this work, City College is an historic, integral, and leading institution. As the founding college of Cuny, City College has always captured my imagination with its striking neo-Gothic campus. I've been thinking about my own association of CCNY with its physical space during a time when we're disconnected from these spaces. We're enabled in new ways now to be bound together through a sense of mission and shared focus. These are the very same drivers that connect us to the thousands of people who have comprised CCNY's School of Education for the past 100 years. I've been reflecting on these faculty, staff, and students who waited anxiously for a Supreme Court decision on Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, watched coverage of the Little Rock Nine, participated in protests in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, or read and dissected A Nation at Risk. And while this year we commemorate CCNY against the backdrop of its substantial past, I must note its vibrant present. Under the guidance of former Dean Mary Driscoll, and now with Dean Lamboy, I've witnessed City's School of Education making new history. As a leader in NYC Men Teach, supporting men of color in their pathway to teaching, and in Algebra for All, deepening the math skills of elementary school teachers. City developed the university's first online graduate certificates in special education, and then created a pipeline for these high-need candidates into jobs. Their faculty lead and serve, from representing on New York State's EdTPA task force or its principal project advisory team, editing academic journals, welcoming new New York City teaching fellows, advocating for bilingual and immigrant students, and advancing community engagement. Every day, they are a testament to the meaning of educating for democracy in a diverse world. And so they prepare their teacher candidates to do the same. As we celebrate the past, relish the present, and anticipate the future, I have every hope and expectation that as we learn from our efforts, or in this case, 100 years worth of efforts, that CCNY's School of Education will be more impressive still. Enjoy tonight, and thank you again.
Thank you, Dean Thompson. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Vincent Boudreau, the president of the City College of New York. President Boudreau.
Thank you, Dean Lamboy. What a pleasure it is to be here. What a pleasure to be here with my friend, Chancellor Felix Martos Rodriguez, Dean Thompson from Cuny, all the former deans of the School of Education come to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the school. I would like to not rehearse again the history of this school, but I do want to bring into the conversation a phrase from the founding of our college, a phrase that I've always found resonant. When the original founders of City College talked about the mission of what they called the College of the City of New York, they talked about it in terms of providing education to the whole people. An image that said, if you're not thinking of everybody, then the society that you live in won't be whole. It'll be fractured and fractious. And we've learned over the years in the education school that milestone after milestone, innovation after innovation, the people who have worked in the School of Education have thought about the particular mission that they should have. We are not an ordinary college. We don't exist in an ordinary university system. This is not an ordinary school of education. We don't live in an ordinary city, and Harlem is not an ordinary neighborhood. The particular expertise that has been honed and cultivated over the generations at the School of Education is how do we provide an education that is particularly suited to educating the whole people, and particularly members of the whole people who had heretofore been left behind or marginalized. And I think about that in relationship to the other idea that's been associated with the work of City College and with the City University of New York, which is social mobility. We brag a great deal with great justification about the fact that the City University of New York has produced 6 times more social mobility than all the Ivy League schools, plus University of Chicago and Duke University and Stanford and MIT combined. We as a collective are extremely proud of that, but we tend to measure that social mobility in the lives of our graduates, and a reflection on the impact of our School of Education and really education across the CUNY system reveals what a shallow interpretation of social mobility that is, impressive though it may be. Because we are not simply educating young people who will then go out and have middle class or better lives. We're educating them in a tradition of service and professional comportment, which orients them towards the underserved, which orients them towards those members of the whole people who have not yet been made whole by our social and economic and political processes. And so we are not simply counting the social mobility that we produce at this school in the lives of our graduates, but in all the concentric rings of members of the whole people who, but for the work of our graduates, and but for the particular expertise that has been cultivated in our graduates. And but for the specific attention that our graduates give to the whole people, might not have been brought into the full benefits of a prosperous and educated society. And I want to reflect on a 100-year anniversary. I am not a historian like our Chancellor. I'm a political scientist. And to our great peril, we are tasked with looking forward more than backward. And so the centenary is both an opportunity to reflect on what we have done and the people that have brought us to this point and the accomplishments of the school, but also to think about what the needs of our society will be going forward. We know that this pandemic and the need to move to distance education has inflicted tremendous costs on the educational progress of our society. And we know that those costs are not evenly distributed in our society. And with that knowledge under our belts, what better school, what better tradition to provision our society to once again eat away at those deficits, to build on the capabilities of the whole people than the City College School of Education and all the other schools of education in the Cuny system. We then enter this centenary, looking backward, yes, celebrating our accomplishments, absolutely, but without question, thinking about our responsibility and our capacity and our enthusiasm for mobilizing who we are and what we've done and what we've learned and how we've taught over the 10 decades of our history into a plan for rebuilding our society after this dreadfully difficult year. And so I want to join with my friends and colleagues in congratulating the School of Education in reaching the 100-year centenary. I want particularly to recognize everyone who today is in the school, making all of the remarkable progress that you've been hearing about in the remarks of the three speakers that came before me. I know that apart from everything else today and this year represents, it represents a moment when you can think about the relationship between your own vocation, your own educational calling, and the gifts and talents and works of everyone that came before you. You stand at a special moment in the history of your school, a moment when you can take stock in your past and gird yourself for the reconstruction and further development of your work in the future. And so on behalf of all of the other educators who have worked in this school, you come to this moment. And I want to recognize you and your hard work and your great success and the hard work and great success of everyone that came before you. We have a remarkable speaker tonight to mark the beginning of our centenary celebration, addressing exactly the topic that has enlivened this school for its century of operation. And so, like most of you, I'm excited to hear Linda Darling-Hammond and what she has to say, and to recognize that as a fitting inauguration of a year of celebration of the 100-year centenary of the City College School of Education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Boudreau. And now to introduce our keynote speaker, Linda Darling-Hammond, Professor Beverly Falk from the Early Childhood Education Program. Professor Falk.
Thank you so much, Dean Lamboy. It is my honor and my pleasure to introduce Linda Darling-Hammond to you today. Dr. Darling-Hammond is the president and CEO of the Learning Policy Institute, a nonprofit that she founded to conduct and communicate research that improves educational policy and practice. She's also the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University. For many decades now, Dr. Darling-Hammond has been at the helm of both state and federal educational policy and practice. She has been named numerous times as one of the most influential people affecting educational policy. Her accomplishments are too numerous to list fully here today, but they include being past president of the American Educational Research Association, the recipient of many awards from that organization, the founder and executive director of the National Commission on Teaching in America's Future, whose 1996 report, What Matters Most, Teaching for America's Future, was one of the most influential reports affecting United States education. And she has been the leader of both President Barack Obama and President Joe Biden's educational policy transition team. Linda began her career as a public school teacher, and she co-founded both a preschool and a public high school. She was the director of the RAND Corporation's education program, and she was also an endowed professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, where she founded the National Center on Restructuring Education, Schools, and Teaching, known as NCREST. She has produced more than 500 publications, which include a number of award-winning books and articles. Dr. Darling-Hammond has accomplished all of this while being the mom of 3 children and now the grandmother of 2. And on a personal note, Linda was my teacher and my mentor at Teachers College, my colleague at NCREST, and overall the years, I'm grateful to say that she has been my friend. One of the most important things I learned from her that has influenced the rest of my career as an educator is that policy needs to be informed by practice. Linda taught me to study what works on the ground in classrooms and schools, and to craft policy decisions and policy lessons that can be scaled up from that. What has always stood out for me about Linda is her deep understanding of the teaching learning process, her respect for teachers, her attention to minoritized and historically under-resourced communities, and her deep and abiding commitment to racial equity and social justice. She harnesses these perspectives to craft and advocate for policies and practices that provide opportunities to learn for all. I am grateful to have Linda in this world as a steadfast warrior for the promises of our democracy. And we are incredibly appreciative to have her here with us at City College, one of the most diverse universities in our nation, to help us better understand ways to ensure that educating the children of the whole people, as articulated in the City College of New York's original mission statement, can be realized to advance our democracy. So welcome, Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hopefully, yes.
Yes.
Great. Beverly, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Chancellor Martos Rodriguez, President Boudreau, Deans Thompson and Lamboy, and Professor Falk, and members of the whole City College community. I'm really honored to be asked to launch the celebration of the City College of New York School of Education Centennial, to be part of the work of such an important institution that has done so much to contribute to equitable and empowering education, and is recommitting to those goals at such an important time. As President Boudreau noted, back in 1847, when the City College was originally founded, Dr. Horace Webster declared, the experiment is to be tried whether the children of the people, the children of the whole people, can be educated, and whether an institution of the highest grade can be successfully controlled by the popular will, not by the privileged few. And I think that what the City College has demonstrated is that the answer to those questions of whether is decidedly yes. City College has been one of the nation's great democratic experiments. It became a jewel in the crown of the city and of the nation. The so-called Harvard of the proletariat, and the Harvard on the Hudson. Although in its early years, the whole people was restricted to white men, and gradually other men, and finally women as well as men, today City College has students from countries all over the world, speakers of 140 languages, and is one of the most diverse institutions in the United States and the world. The School of Education's mission statement notes that the School of Education of the City College of New York prepares educators to support students of our diverse citizenry to meet the challenges of the 21st century and to be active participants in our democracy. As teachers, scholars, and learners, we seek to educate teachers and leaders who are responsive to the needs of urban schools, who can use students' diversity as a resource, and who can maximize learning for all, who can engage in scholarship that advances knowledge, informs policy, and improves practice, so that all students have support and an opportunity to receive a quality education, who can join, encourage, advocate, teach, and learn in collaborative school and community improvement efforts locally, nationally, and internationally to help shape educational settings now and in the future, a theme to which I will return in my remarks. Most important, uniting our efforts is our commitment to education as a moral endeavor that can enhance the human condition, realize possibilities, and make the world a more just place. Enhancing the human condition, realizing possibilities, and making the world a more just place, as the mission statement notes, has meant pushing back on the constraints of standardized, bureaucratized education that stifles the human spirit and that underserves the children of the whole people, especially those who are furthest from opportunity. So many new possibilities for education and for children's lives have been the product of City College's work, and I am here to attest that these have traveled across the country and around the world. When I came to New York in 1989 and connected to the amazing cadre of brilliant and innovative educators here, I heard them talk about City College, about the Cuny system, and about the Workshop Center for Open Education, which was established at City College in 1970 by Professor Lillian Weber. I was dazzled by the work of educators like Deborah Meyer, who founded Central Park East Elementary and Secondary Schools, and that of other colleagues who were designing new schools featuring active, project-based, learner-centered teaching and assessment. Workshop Center community members, including Eleanor Duckworth, Ted Sizer, Ted Chittenden, Deborah Meyer, David Hawkins, and the wonderful Beverly Falk, then both a student and a teacher of mine. Many of the educators who participated in the Workshop Center's programs went on to found and lead the innovative small schools movement in New York City and around the country, which included, in addition to the Central Park East Elementary and Secondary Schools at that time, Brooklyn New School, the Bronx New School, Muscota New School, and small high schools like the International High Schools, Fannie Lou Hamer, Beacon, Cydia School, and many others. These schools were organized to be run democratically and to support democratic thinking and development among students, with shared norms created by and with students, decision-making through classroom and school-wide meetings for both students and faculty, connections to families and community, support providers as partners in the work of growing up healthy children together. And these models have spread across the city and across the country. I will tell you, I personally carried some of them to California with me when I came. These schools were also developers and practitioners of performance assessment through a performance assessment collaborative in New York that has an analog in the Center for Collaborative Education in New England, and that we have since replicated in California through the California Performance Assessment Collaborative. And from there, it has also spread to Hawaii, North Dakota, and other parts of the country. Bev Falk and I co-authored a book called Authentic Assessment in Action that documented some of this wonderful work, which is also part of the process of educating for democracy. These projects and assessments, which continue in the work of the New York Performance Standards Collaborative and many others, were and are designed to foster student agency, engagement in relevant work, critical thinking, a wide range of skills for planning, organizing, collaborating, problem solving, deeply analyzing and presenting ideas and solutions. Equally, and perhaps even more important, is that they are typically selected and designed to be community connected and aimed at social thinking and democratic participation. The work has grown and spread. One of the New York City teachers who worked with those who carried on that work in New York City is now the performance assessment director in Oakland, California. Youngwon Choi has planted senior projects and exhibitions in those schools that ask students to identify and research a problem in the community, work as an intern in an organization that's seeking to address this problem in order to understand it experientially as well as analytically, and make a contribution to solving it, and present this research in an exhibition at the end of the year. I recently observed one tackling racial inequalities in healthcare that are endemic not only in Oakland, but across the country. This informs work throughout high school. And one of the things we've seen in this era of the pandemic is that the schools that have been able to engage and connect children and older students and youth to their education are the ones that have carried on this kind of work. In one Oakland high school, group of students was engaged when the pandemic hit in studying the traffic patterns around their school and how to solve for the fact that it was unsafe for so many young people to get to school. And they continued when schools closed and everyone into remote learning last March to study that problem, to figure out traffic patterns, what would be needed in terms of various solutions to the way in which both walkways and sidewalks were constructed and traffic was routed, and presented their findings to the Oakland City Council at the end of the year and actually achieved improvements in the safety of the environment around their school. Those kinds of things, while some students were disconnecting and teachers were struggling with how to engage students in distance learning, continue to be alive, vibrant, connected, and part of the democratic experiment, part of the education of the children of the whole people that really enables and empowers them to become part of the citizenry that solves problems in the present and in the future. This work is becoming very important and timely once again, as we're reemerging from an era of regressive policy that has deepened inequality in every aspect of American life, even as it has sought to manage schools quite often through standardized testing without investing. Just as was true at the time that City College's School of Education was first founded, we've been through a period of scientific managers looking to make schools quote unquote efficient, to manage schools with more tightly prescribed curriculum, more teacher-proof texts, more extensive testing, more rules and regulations. In this recent era, as was true 100 years ago, the technocrats consciously sought to hire less well-educated teachers who would work for lower wages and go along with the new regime of prescribed lessons and pacing schedules without protest. At that time, 100 years ago, nationally distributed tests of arithmetic, handwriting, and English were put into use. Their results were used to compare students, teachers, and schools, to report to the public, and even to award merit pay, a short-lived innovation due to the many problems it caused. And we've seen a repetition of these strategies in recent years. Does any of this sound familiar? Of course, in the view of these brilliant managerial engineers, professionally trained teachers were considered troublesome because they had their own ideas about education and didn't go along meekly with the plan. As one such teacher wrote in the American Teacher in the early part of the 20th century, just as City College School of Education was being founded, we have yielded to the arrogance of big businessmen and have accepted their criteria of efficiency at their own valuation without question. We've consented to measure the results of educational efforts in terms of price and product, the terms that prevail in the factory and the department store. But education, since it deals in the first place with human organisms and in the second place with individualities, is not analogous to a standardizable manufacturing process. Education must measure its efficiency, not in terms of so many promotions per dollar of expenditure, nor even in terms of so many student hours per dollar of salary. It must measure its efficiency in terms of increased humanism, increased power to do, increased capacity to appreciate. Indeed, in this current era of crisis, we are experiencing a new realization of the importance of increased humanism. The pandemic, which has launched a public health crisis, an economic crisis, we've been in the midst of a climate crisis, and we are engaged in an overdue racial reckoning, has really opened the possibilities for massive social change. Every major social revolution in the United States that has brought progress on these fronts has occurred on the heels of great social disruption. And it has been the product of efforts by people of courage and people of conscience to turn tragedy into opportunity. As these eras of progress, interestingly, have happened about almost exactly every 30 years. The 1870s, the Reconstruction Era, when Black legislators were elected and first created public education systems in the South and enacted other progressive legislation, of course, came on the heels of the Civil War. The early 1900s, when John Dewey, Ella Flagg Young, and others were greeting the transition from an agrarian to a manufacturing economy with new schools and new approaches to progressive education. The 1930s, following the Great Depression, which was turned into a progressive era for racial and economic breakthroughs that ultimately got us to Brown versus Board of Education, but also created Social Security and the Progressive Education Association, and work that the City College was very much engaged in. The 1960s, following civil rights marches and the assassinations of JFK, Malcolm X, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, led to the Voting Rights Act, the War on Poverty, the Great Society, and the opportunities that led up to a lot of the progressive reforms in education that I talked about a few moments ago. The 1990s, which led to the reforms in social policy and education that I mentioned, with New York City at the center of a great reinvention of public education. And 2020 is the next start of a 30-year cycle. We can see the pages being turned to a renewed and concerted effort to create new forms of democratic education and to address inequalities in our social system. It is clear that we cannot and should not, as we reopen and restart schools, return to normal. Since its inception, we know that our education system has been deeply erratic in delivering on the promise of a quality education for all of America's children. The pandemic has put a stark light on an emerging truth that education as we know it is over, and we must think of school in deeply different ways if we're to serve the children of the whole people in equitable and empowering fashion. Our current system did take shape almost exactly a century ago, when, as I noted, the scientific managers were looking for ways to accommodate the huge influx of students into urban areas from migration and immigration, coupled with the spread of compulsory education. The primary goal was preparing students for manual work on farms and in factories. And so schools were developed to maximize rule following and rote learning and to minimize relationships. Only a small number of students were identified for access to the higher order skills needed for thinking work. Funding, school assignment, and tracking systems were designed to allocate students to their places in life, and they were enacted within context of deep-seated racial, ethnic, and cultural prejudice. Educators and policymakers have sought to evolve the system over the ensuing decades, led very substantially by your own faculty and graduates of the City College, with recurring eras of reform that have made dents in the systems we inherited. However, in this moment where we have more knowledge about human development and learning, when society and the economy demand a more challenging set of skills, when there is a greater social demand for and commitment to equitable education, it is time to use the huge disruptions caused by this pandemic to reinvent our systems of education. We live in a nation that has been engaging in what Gloria Ladson-Billings has called the aggressive neglect of its children. The US now has a far higher poverty rate for children than any other industrialized country, at 1 in 4 at least, nearly double what it was 30 years ago. A more tattered safety net, more who are homeless, without health care and without food security, a more segregated and inequitable system of public education in which the highest spending districts spend 10 times more than the lowest spending districts in this country. And within states, including New York, there's a ratio of 3 or 4 to 1 in respect to the highest and lowest spending districts. A larger and more costly system of incarceration than any other country in the world, including China, in which we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of its inmates. One that is directly cutting into the money we should be spending on education. A defense budget larger than the next 20 countries combined, and greater disparities in wealth than any other leading country. A disparity in which the wealthiest 1% of individuals control more resources than the bottom 50% of citizens. Until recently, our leaders have not talked about these things, and they have simply said of poor children, let them eat tests. And while there is a lot of talk of international score comparisons on tests, there's too little talk about what high-performing countries actually do. Fund schools equitably, invest in high-quality free preparation for all of their teachers, in mentoring and professional development for teachers and leaders that is widely and freely available, completely at government expense, organizing a curriculum around problem solving and critical thinking skills, and testing students rarely and never with multiple choice tests. Indeed, the top performing nations increasingly rely on school-based assessments of learning that include the challenging projects, investigations, and performances like those leading educators have created in innovative New York schools, again, led by many from the City College. It is a new day. We saw in November and again in the days that have since ensued since the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, that our democracy can and will survive, and it will emerge as a phoenix from the ashes, more brilliant and powerful than ever before. In just 2 months, our new administration has reinstated civil rights that were being swept away. It has planted new seeds of racial justice. It has reestablished the role of science in society. It has begun to turn around the pandemic, rolling out millions of vaccinations. In fact, more than 500,000 educators were vaccinated in the last week alone, and has already enacted the largest anti-poverty bill for children that we have seen since the war on poverty in the 1960s. If we stay with this agenda, we will have once again cut childhood poverty in half by the end of this decade. The $125 billion coming to K-12 education in the COVID relief package that was just enacted will not only help us to reopen schools safely, it will help us to establish health and mental health supports, community schools that wrap around children to meet their needs, support for teacher pipelines that can solve shortages and strengthen preparation and professional development, funding for access to college that is tuition-free and debt-free, like the commitment that City College was founded on, and so important for educators so that we can attract the wonderful people who want to enter the profession in a way that they can afford to both enter and stay. President Biden's commitment to education includes plans for universal pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds, tripling Title I dollars in ways that solve inequalities to access to quality curriculum, respecting and investing in teacher leadership, expanding pathways to college and careers. We must use this moment as an opportunity to reinvent our education system. We now know so much more than we did 100 years ago about how people learn, about how to enhance learning through the kind of inquiry-oriented, culturally relevant pedagogy and curriculum. And we should know from the science of learning and development how to rethink the way schools are organized, as so many of you have already begun to do in New York City. We know from that science, from neuroscience, about how the brain architecture is formed, as well as from developmental and learning sciences, that relationships are the essential ingredient that catalyzes healthy development and learning. We know that children actively construct knowledge by connecting what they know to what they're learning within their cultural contexts. We know that learning is social and emotional as well as academic, and that in fact, it is completely connected how we feel about our learning environment. If we feel positively, if we feel safe, if we feel trusted, if we are engaged and interested in what we're learning, we learn much more than when we feel traumatized, when we worry about stereotype threat, when we worry about being stigmatized by others in our environment, then we learn much less well. So it is very important that we build the social and emotional foundation on which effective academic learning is built. It is not a deflection from academic learning. It is the pathway to that learning. We know that students' perceptions of their own ability influence their learning. And that has to make us question the tracking systems that have designated students, even from the early age of 4 or 5 years old, as some being gifted and having potential, and by implication, others not being gifted or talented or having potential. We know that adversity affects learning, that effective schools have to be both trauma informed so that we understand what may have occurred with children and what may be underlying the way in which they're trying to cope in their behaviors. And they also have to be healing focused and not focused on labeling students only as traumatized, but providing the mindful, supportive, relationship-oriented settings in which healing can actually occur. And this means reinventing school in ways that center relationships, that allow educators to deeply understand what children know and have experienced so they can build on it, draw connections to new learning. That means that we need to enable students to see their strengths and what they do know, to feel competent and confident so they can learn, supporting educators in recognizing the effects of trauma, accessing resources for children, and supporting their attachment and healing, rather than unwittingly allowing schools to exacerbate the effects of trauma. What a return to school should not look like with this knowledge is that we should not be testing students to label them and place them in high, average, and low groups that are segregated by perceived ability and often by race and class as well, that are engaged in regimented drill and kill remedial instruction in these segregated groups, in which anxiety and stigma imposed by references to learning loss or students being behind or in deficit create another barrier to the learning process itself, in which students receive, quote, personalization by being put in front of programmed computers for machine-based instruction for long hours at a time, or with worksheets that offer the same decontextualized approach to learning, punishing students who disengage or express frustration and despair, or putting the most needy students in classes with the least trained and experienced teachers who are least likely to know how to create productive learning environments. What our return to school should be like, both this spring, this summer, and into the future, with the explicit goal of ensuring that students are supported, affirmed, and cared for, will be environments that are structured to enable warm relationships, because they provide long-term relationships between adults and children through looping, through advisory systems, and through mentoring relationships. Time in the schedule for creating community, trust, belonging among students and with families. Time for outdoor play and safe sports, expressive arts, collaborative activities that grow and improve things, murals and school gardens and school classroom community improvement projects, formative assessments that help us know where students are in their wellness, and their social and emotional supports as well as academically, and help identify next steps rather than producing labels. Learning acceleration through additional time and tutoring rather than tracking. Tutoring which creates and builds relationships, which personalizes the experience to students' specific needs, which leverages strong learning gains and additional time in strategies that may range from reading recovery to a variety of other well-tested, highly successful tutoring approaches that augment the learning in heterogeneous groups that brings us together, that brings together the children of the whole people. And of course, authentic learning tasks that are connected to students' personal and cultural experiences that put students in a position of taking agency in their lives. As we seek to redesign schools, we need to really attend to the several barriers that I've mentioned that need to be transformed in this process. One, of course, is the unequal resources that still exist in this country that lead to inequitable opportunities, programs, and teacher and leader distribution. Our country allocates education funds more unequally than virtually any other in the industrialized world. But this is on the agenda for President Biden and Vice President Harris. It is something that is always on the agenda in the states. As one of my friends, John Jackson, says, every state has its state bird, its state flag, and its state school finance lawsuit. New York has had its state school finance lawsuit for far too many years, and we need to redouble efforts to equalize opportunity. Equal opportunity for deeper learning of the kind demanded in this century, not restricting a thinking curriculum to a minority of students. It's important to recognize that countries like Finland and many others that have been propelled to the top of the international rankings in education, in part because of the investments they've made in deep teacher preparation, have also detracked their schooling systems so that everybody gets access to the same curriculum together all the way through about 10th grade, when kids begin to specialize into their areas of vocational interest that they will pursue. And of course, we need to be understanding, integrating social and emotional learning and skills into the curriculum, not just as an add-on on the side for the way in which personalization and relationships are structured. That will mean helping parents and every member of the school community understand child development in the ways that I know you at City College have been developing and propounding for so many years, so that everyone can wrap around children in the same way to help support developmental learning and growth and relationships, and to reduce sources of trauma that otherwise get exacerbated, sometimes in homes, sometimes in schools, sometimes in communities. This all depends on the kind of powerful teacher education that this College of Education was founded to engage in. And as my colleagues and I outlined in a book we wrote recently called Preparing Teachers for Deeper Learning, what teachers need in their learning, as you know, is what students need in theirs. Authentic opportunities to experience the collaboration and inquiry that they want for their students, opportunities to experience the same pedagogies they want to learn and use in their practice, and places in partnership with public schools where they can be part of a learning community that is focused on these goals. And this has been the work of your college that is so needed in this moment, both for your own students, graduates, alumni, and the children they serve, and for those of us who learn from the work that you do and carry it elsewhere in the country. As I've noted, we're entering a day where huge progress can be made, in which we must put deep roots down on these areas of progress so that they will last when the next pushback occurs, as it no doubt will. Maya Angelou once observed, while one may encounter many defeats, one must not be defeated. In every era of history, every step of progress has resulted from the resilience of determined people who have suffered defeats, bombings, lynchings, setbacks of all kinds, while not being defeated. As Ella's song from Sweet Honey and the Rock reminds us, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We who work for freedom must recognize we are part of a centuries-long march toward education justice and equality. And this is the time to redouble our efforts to demand human rights and educate for social responsibility. Take heart in knowing that the arc of history is long, as Martin Luther King noted, but it tends toward justice. Take courage in knowing that where a community of hands comes together to work toward justice, a freedom seed will grow, as Langston Hughes put it. And take pride in knowing when the work is challenging and setbacks come, as they must, when anything important is happening, that you are building a better future for every child and family and community you touch. As John Dewey counseled, what the best and wisest parent wants for his or her child, that must the community want for all of its children. Any other goal is narrow and unlovely. Acted upon, it destroys our democracy. Only by being true to the full growth of all the individuals who make it up can society by any chance be true to itself. Thank you for each and every time you do what is right for our children and for the educators who serve them, and for every ripple of hope that you create. Thank you for your courage and your commitment that feeds the beacon of light that City College shines over the city and that travels around the country and around the world.
Linda, thank you so much for those wonderful remarks that both help us understand our situation and our context, and that give us courage and optimism for the future.
It is my great pleasure. I am going to sit down and plug my computer in because it's almost out of battery juice while you're getting the panel organized.
Okay. Okay, and at this time, I'd like to invite my colleagues, Nancy Cardwell and Professor Lamboy, to join us to present with you some questions that have come up for from our audience and our participants. So take a deep breath.
Yeah. I'm ready.
Sure. And we're going to take turns in asking you some of the questions, but what we've tried to do is cull some themes from questions that have been submitted in advance and present them to you. And for those of you who are participating in this event, we would like to invite you to join us on Twitter for our Twitter talk. And you can use the hashtag CCNYSOECENTENNIAL, all lowercase letters, CCNY School of Ed Centennial. And that is being monitored by our colleague Shobha Kavakanudio. We'd also invite you to follow us at CCNYSOE, all one word. So let's begin. You raised so many important issues for us, Linda, and the history that and the legacy that we work to carry on today to educate the children of the whole people and broadening this notion of the whole people from what it was 100 years ago at City College's early years to include the underrepresented and under-resourced communities who have been minoritized in our society. This question is a little bit of a pathway off of the ones we shared with you initially, but I wonder if you could speak a little to the fact of the importance of having a diverse teaching force, and especially in a diverse city. And I know there's a lot of research about the impact of having a culturally congruent teacher in the life of a student's trajectory. And if you could speak a little bit about that and the work that, which is so impactful and the work that we do.
Yes, as you know, at LPI, we've been doing a lot of work on the sort of synthesizing the research on diversity in the educator workforce and why it is important and also what it means. And I will note that there's been a set of studies recently that have found in particular that when Black students have one or more Black teachers in the course of their education, it can transform their experiences both in terms of achievement, attainment, and ongoing work in education. And I want to just say I experienced such a teacher for my own kids. Third grade in New York, Faye Freeman, I want to call her name out because she was amazing, national board certified teacher who, when each of two of my three kids went to third grade, had the opportunity to teach in a way that was so affirming, was so connected to each individual child, was not only a role model, but also a source of strength, commitment, belief in possibility and capacity and competence, that it really did propel them for the rest of their school careers. So I think part of what we want to understand is what is it about that experience that children need. And some of the studies have also found that the Black teachers who were studied also did better for other groups of students as well. And I don't think it's just genealogical. I think it is the life experience that some people bring to the classroom and the belief in the students who often are experiencing implicit bias or often experiencing limitations from the environment that they're in that frees that capacity to move forward. So is it important to have a diverse teaching workforce? Absolutely. Is it important to have a group of adults in a school who represent all the children of the whole people? Absolutely, because they bring together knowledge and commitments that they can share with each other to teach all the kids in their class. Does that mean we should go back to the days of segregation, where white teachers are only teaching white students and Black teachers are only teaching Black students and so on? Absolutely not. And I think some people misrepresent that body of evidence in a way that gets us to a race matching kind of conclusion. And we need to be very mindful that what we're seeing here is the ability of a diverse teaching workforce to be both knowledgeable about students and share that knowledge, to be representative of role models for children as they are trying to figure out their place in the world, and together to build the pedagogy that in our teacher education we want to bring to every teacher about how to be affirming, how to seek competence in our students, how to bring that competence to the fore, and how to create the confidence that then will propel all children to the futures that they deserve.
Thank you. Thank you for raising those important issues. Yeah. Nancy, do you want to
Sure.
take a question?
Sure. Hi, Linda. It's really nice to see you again. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your thoughts. It's really inspiring to connect with our past so that it really motivates us for the next 100 years. And sort of building on that, we had a number of questions that came in about authentic assessments. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, given that, in this time of COVID, that the majority of white children have experienced in-person learning, and the majority of Black and Brown children have experienced completely remote learning. I'm wondering, how can our educational systems move towards more authentic assessments that can be used for both learning about what children are learning and used to improve teaching, as well as to understand how well we're teaching?
Mhm. Well, you know, New York has been a place where so much amazing practice has occurred in that regard, with respect to the schools that have been developing, you know, portfolios for graduation and a variety of other tools that construct a process for learning in which, and for assessment, in which there are standards, in which there are a set of expectations. I know deeply the rubrics that are used by the New York Performance Standards Consortium, for example. Those are very rigorous expectations within each of the disciplines, as well as there's interdisciplinary work. But children, you know, select the text that they will analyze, you know, they select the science experiments that they will undertake to meet those, and then they engage in a process of deep inquiry in the disciplines over multiple years, revising their work to meet standards, presenting it to the equivalent of little dissertation committees, if you will, of other students, faculty, people from inside and outside the school, and then continuing to deeply explore, explain, and understand that work in the way that we know that we deeply learn. So we want that kind of practice. That actually is in the assessment systems of many countries around the world. And if anybody's interested in exploring that, I wrote a book with colleagues called Beyond the Bubble Test. And it shows how in Singapore and Australia and the UK and many other places, assessment is usually some combination of essay and open-ended responses to some questions and actual classroom-based projects in which you're doing the work and teachers are scoring the work. And that's the way that assessment, even on a governmental level, occurs. Obviously, it needs to be combined with the assessments that are going on in the classroom for the purpose of teaching and learning. We've got to take, we have done some of this in the 1990s in this country in a number of states. New York was part of that. I don't know if any of you are old enough, Bev is old enough to remember with me the 35% option on the Regents exams where people created projects and those contributed to the Regents exams. The New York Regents portfolio, the literacy assessment that you designed, Bev, that I think is still, you know, used in many parts of New York, where people are in the work, doing the work, and the assessment is a learning experience itself, right? And so I think we need to get back to the place where that is part of the way we think about large-scale assessment, as well as day-to-day learning and assessment for children. I see many people are putting the question in the chat about the Ed TPA. So I think I should go ahead and answer that because it's seen. I'm going to take a drink of water first, though. And the question is kind of how can you have a standardized assessment that is also authentic? But in many ways, the EdTPA, I'm not connected, by the way, to the EdTPA. I'm not part of its functioning or its, I don't get any money from it. I wasn't part of the design of the administration process. But I was part of the performance assessment for California teachers design, which led to the EdTPA. And the framework is the same. It comes from the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards portfolio for board certification. And again, it has common rubrics. What holds it together, like the New York Performance Standards Consortium assessments, are the common rubrics, which are built on what we know about effective teaching. But candidates choose the lesson that they're going to prepare. They decide what the curriculum is that they're going to work on within their content area. There's very little constraint on that. It has to include a scientific inquiry in science, but what that inquiry is, you figure that out yourself. They design a curriculum. They explain how they're adapting it to the needs of their English learners, students with disabilities, or others who have particular learning needs. They teach it, have videotapes of their teaching. And then they analyze student learning and say, what would I do next? All of that is decided, designed, and enacted in an experiential way by the candidates themselves against some shared rubrics which say these are things we know about good teaching. Now, is it a challenging thing to do? Yes, it is a challenging thing to do. It's particularly challenging in places that don't have a full year of student teaching. So part of what has to happen is building the context for enactment of teaching skills that is needed. But I just finished teaching a class at Stanford in the teacher ed program. I taught the special education class this year. And we worked with our students on TPA because that's what Stanford is now using. And I'm getting the responses now from my students saying, thank you so much. I learned so much about teaching by doing this performance assessment. I think if people are well supported in the process of learning to teach, they need to be able to bring together, how do I design a curriculum? How do I teach it? How do I assess student learning? And make their own good decisions about what they're passionate about, what they care about, what they want to be teaching in their classroom, to give voice to and give purpose to their teaching. So yes, there's a standardized way of assessing this. I will also say that, across the country, 90+% of people who take the EdTPA ultimately pass it because like anything else, you can, grow in your practice. And that might feel constraining. I can understand why some people would say we shouldn't have any constraints, but we have to decide as a profession what we're going to be held accountable to. There is a bar exam for every lawyer. There is a medical licensing exam for every doctor. And there are lots of multiple choice tests of teachers, which have huge disparities in the way they play out for students of color and white candidates that are barriers along the way to becoming a teacher and do not have any predictive relationship to how good the person is as a teacher. So in my view, it's those standardized tests that we should be most concerned about. We should get to a place in teaching where we, in fact, have one assessment that doesn't prevent you from entering teacher ed, does not prevent you from graduating from teacher education, but really allows you to demonstrate how you can do the fundamental tasks of teaching in ways that are really experiential, performance-based, and supportive of learning.
Thank you. So powerfully. And the expression that so many people have used about the EdTPA is that it's an instrument to help determine that we are leaving our education in educator preparation safe to practice and ready to teach, and can do the foundational skills and of what teaching is all about. Another issue that has come up and that you raised a lot in your comments, Linda, were you mentioned about a continuation of the issue of diversity, that, and we know you're involved in federal policy. We know you've been involved in state policies. The issue of moving on from the time of Brown versus Board of Education and the civil rights movement and the desegregation of schools. And we have experienced those movements, as you said, over 30-year periods. And we find ourselves today in 2021, still in a segregated school system nationally, as well as in New York City, probably one of the most segregated school systems in the nation. And we would really be grateful to hear some of your thoughts about how to address this issue, how to create greater integration and greater equity, racial equity in the schools that we have, and how to go about moving toward that.
Well, we did make a lot of progress in the 60s and 70s, and we were far more integrated in 1988, which was the sort of the high point of integration, than we are today. What happened was there was a lot of policy that supported integration during the 60s and the 70s, almost all of which was undone and thrown away in the 1980s during the Reagan years. And so by the end of that period of time, we began to push back in the other direction. You know, problems with the housing policies as well as the school policies and so on. And we are now more segregated today than we were 30 years ago. By the way, in the period when we were desegregating and we were beginning to equalize funding and school finance reforms and you know, addressing a lot of other barriers, the achievement gap, the Black-white achievement gap in literacy declined by more than half over the period of just about 15 years. And the math achievement gap reduced by more than a third. And then when resegregation and the undoing of a lot of the other equity policies occurred, our achievement gap began to grow again, and it is now 30% larger than it was 30 years ago. So, you know, history, one of the big epiphanies for me is that history is not a steady path of progress. Every time you make some equity progress, there's a serious pushback from those who don't want to see that progress. And we saw that in the response to, you know, Jim Crow following Reconstruction. We've seen it in the response, you know, after the civil rights era of the 60s and 70s. We're going to see it again. So one of the things that we obviously we need to do, and this president and vice president have a very robust agenda for desegregating schools. There's a wonderful set of bills in the Congress for renewing our commitment to equalizing funding across different school sites and to addressing inequalities in a variety of ways. We will, if we put our shoulder to the wheel in every part of the society, make some progress on that in this next decade. We've got to be strategic to make sure that we make that progress in a way that plants deep roots on the strategies that we engage in, that it makes them systemic and institutionalized. There is institutional racism. There has to be institutional anti-racism that we plant, so that when the, you know, predictable pushback comes, we've made progress and we are able to hold on to that progress to the greatest extent possible. To me, that means things like, you know, often we have lots of, you know, projects that we do in the United States. We're very innovative. We have more innovations that people from around the world come to see. You know, this really innovative school over here, or this really cool project over there. What we are less good at is thinking about how do we scale that up? How do we make sure that it is equitably available to all, that it's built into policy, it's built into governmental systems, it's built into institutional policy, that we really then can hold on to it and make it widely available so that we don't innovate ourselves to death. You know, we need to really build incrementally on each step that we make and be sure that we bring it into the way in which we regularly do business for all kids. And I think that's a really big challenge in, you know, every part of it, you know, in every university and every school system. And we can all be thinking about that. How do we make this more than, you know, an interesting project? How do we make this part of the way we do business?
Big challenge. Edwin, would you like to take the next?
Sure. First, Linda, it's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for being here with us. I want to very quickly follow up on what you said about the ETPA. I attended a meeting earlier today in which this issue about the ETPA and whether it's reliable or not came up, and somebody said something that I found quite interesting, which is, if we're going to be that critical of the ETPA, should we then be as critical in every single assessment that we use in our courses, in our teacher preparation programs? And I think that's an excellent point. So my question is about the implementation of culturally responsive curricula, and the fact that, as you said in your address, you mentioned the issue of standardized testing. How do we reconcile both sides of the coin, so to speak?
Say a little more about what you're thinking about there.
So we as educators, we are in favor of a curriculum that is culturally responsive, right? That takes the student into consideration. But at the same time, there's a lot of test prepping in our schools.
Right.
So how can we marry both? How can we move in one direction and away from the other direction to be successful in the classrooms? And for us to prepare teachers who are able to take the needs of their students in their classrooms.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. There's so many angles on that.
Yes.
And just to go back to the sort of fundamental issues of standardized testing, and I just want to say, with respect to, for example, the EdTPA, it can be improved on, and people ought to get about the business of improving on it, right? When we invented the performance assessment for California teachers, we all as professors scored it ourselves within our own institutions. That's an option for EdTPA. Very few people take folks up on it, but it is an option, at least in California, because we insisted on it, because we actually think that knowing the students' work ourselves helps us become better professors and better educators as well. So it's not the be all and end all. It tries to approach standards without standardization by allowing people to bring their own curriculum and their own teaching and experience and context into it. And I think that should be the framework for assessment generally. But I also think that if we can get to the place where we don't so distrust the educators who are assessors that we require things to be sent out and scored by somebody else, we'll also do better at using the knowledge that we gain from it. And the same is true for our students. So, we need assessments that for kids that are also standards without standardization, in which kids can bring their own knowledge base. For example, I use the New York Performance Standards Consortium. Kids choose their own topics for the science inquiries and the, ELA literary analyses, et cetera. And they can bring culturally responsive and community contextualized work into that kind of an assessment. We have an assessment, a testing enterprise now that is completely, in most places, completely commercialized, and it's people who are building tests outside of the context of our schools, sending them in. A lot of them are multiple choice, which I think is not building the kind of cognition that we need for the future. I mean, there's no job you're ever going to go to where they say, here's a set of questions, pick one answer out of 5 and go home for the day because you're done. There is no place where in the real world you pick one answer out of 5 and that's what you do. It's not the way we think when we're doing real work, solving real problems. So we need to move assessment towards exhibitions of learning that allow us to have both culturally responsive curricula. That's a thing that we also have to be working on. We just in California passed the first ethnic studies model curriculum in the country. And that's a resource for teachers. It's not a mandate, but we need to find ways to get culturally responsive curriculum tools, materials, and thinking, both in the way that our educators are prepared and in the way the curriculum is conceived of in schools. And then we need assessments that even when they have some standardized tools for scoring, like rubrics, allow for students to bring themselves and their cultural knowledge and contextualized knowledge into the assessment process in the ways we've been talking about. I'm interested in the fact that in Finland, when you sit, there's only one external exam in Finland, and it's created by the college professors and the high school teachers together. It's called the Matriculation Exam. It's voluntary if you want to go to college, you take it. Kids choose it's all open-ended. It's a bunch of essay, questions and product develop, product solutions to math and science puzzles of various kinds. Kids choose the items that they will respond to. And so there's a lot of opportunity, and they have a very multicultural curriculum. But even though it is standardized, there's choice in the process of deciding how to demonstrate what you know. In Denmark, when they take assessments, which are also open-ended, kids have full access to the internet to answer the questions that are on the national exam. Why? Because that's how we actually function in the real world. Our work is contextualized. So the old idea that it's like stuff your head full of facts and try hard to remember them and come and spit them out on a standardized test with, answering pick 1 out of 5 is just very antiquated. And it's also culturally unresponsive. A lot of the tests, I should get off the soapbox, but they're constructed with a norming group. Even if they call themselves criterion reference, the people who normally score high on the test, if there are items when they look at the item responses that those kids don't do well on, but for example, students of color do well on, those items get tossed out because they don't norm properly against the more advantaged students who are the norming population. So there's so many ways in which the testing system we have now is constructed to maintain advantage, to narrow the way in which we allow people to show what they know, or to choose what they care about, or to contextualize their knowledge and their learning process in things that allow them to make connections that we have to get past to get to the kinds of assessments that we really need. There's going to have to be, quite a bit of invention there. I do think we are poised again at a moment where a lot of progress can be made in that regard, and we'll need to, figure out how to do it. I also am sympathetic to the concerns that many civil rights groups bring forward about needing some comparable assessments so that we can see where disparities are, so that we can rectify those disparities and not just accept that as the way things are. And so that's the delicate dance that we have to be able to do, is how to create contextualized, culturally responsive standards without standardization, within which we can both teach and learn more effectively and see what kind of progress we're making in order to address inequalities, with resources.
Thank you. What a challenge.
It is, but I know that you all are up to it. So I put it on your plate.
Thank you, Linda. We want to be mindful of your time and this wonderful gift that you have given to us of spending some time with us here today. We're so grateful that you have helped us understand today our current crisis and our current situation in the context of the pendulum swings of history, and to see that there are opportunities and possibilities that are offered to us by this current crisis. You've offered us a history lesson, you've offered us optimism, you've offered us encouragement and inspiration to embrace this time as an opportunity to move toward greater democracy. And I know that and I'm sure everyone participating is going to take this away from our time together today. So I want to just say again, so grateful to have you in this world. So grateful to have you continuing your advocacy efforts. And I know that Dean Lamboy would like to also offer some final words of thanks and reflection to you as well. Unmute.
You're on mute.
Yes. How many times have we been told, you're muted, you're muted? Again, Linda, thank you so very much. You are not just a superstar and an inspiration, but you are a very kind person. And we appreciate you being here. You taking, from your busy schedule, taking some time to be with us and to inspire us. So we greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, you inspire me, so I appreciate that. And it's great to see you all again. And I think you'll be well launched on the next 100 years. Keep leading us.
Thank you. This was a very exciting keynote address. What a way to kick off our Centennial celebration. One of the things what I was looking forward in Linda's address was getting inspiration to learn what are the things we could do for the next 100 years of the School of Education. How can we re-envision teacher education in the next 100 years? So to my colleagues, Beverly and Nancy, what would you say to that?
Well, I think, I was really inspired by the things that she said. And I think really framing this very difficult moment after a year of so much suffering particularly among our students and their families, to really see this as a moment of reemergence, rebirth, reinvention. I think it gives me a lot of hope in terms of what it is that we as a School of Education could do to participate in this, in this next phase to set us up for the next 100 years.
I was struck by Linda's comments about the conversation, the dialogue that's going on in the news and around the country about learning loss and trauma and the impact, the negative impact that can be had by dwelling on those things and turning them into deficits. And instead thinking about her theme, which is that this crisis can be an opportunity, and taking advantage of the opportunities that students, both children's students and our teacher learner students have now to the learning that they've taken from living through a crisis and from handling things and managing things and recognizing important things about life that this crisis has revealed, both in terms of the social justice issues that have been, a light has been shined on them, but also to the things that have resulted from having to be isolated during this time, of recognizing the importance of family and community and caring for each other and being kind to each other. And that if we nourish that in our work, in our teacher education programs, that we can help model that for our teacher learners to bring to the children for whom they're entrusted with care.
And I think just to extend that just a bit, to go back to something she talked about, which was about, community schooling. Like when she was talking about that, it reminded me of the model of schooling that David Dinkins, put into practice during his tenure as mayor, where the school was like the hub of the community, and that services could be, lots of community services could be wrapped around children and their families in ways that opened up connections with the broader society. And I'm also thinking about, this notion of trauma, and that we don't have to be anchored in the trauma, but that what it would mean if we could, as a School of Education, partner, maybe with the DOE and with the state and with school districts in New York City, to really think about what would it look like for us to reimagine our public schools as healing spaces, you know, where education, where quality education happened in a healing environment, you know, where we're teaching the way children learn.
Gave a lot of good
was
examples of that.
Yeah.
Very
You
good
know,
example.
of creating community gardens and doing outdoor kinds of projects and things that revitalize the community. And they're cross-disciplinary. They can be so rigorous in terms of content and disciplinary skills. And they can also be enjoyable and attached to children's interests, which I just read a brief from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, which focuses a lot on neuroscience research. And there's actual neuroscience research now that shows how interest is a motivating force for learning. That's been theorized about so much and been observed by people, but you can actually see in MRIs how when learners are engaged in something that's of interest to them, that there are more neural connections being made.
Right.
Fascinating. So yeah, so that's the direction that this this crisis can lead us to. And it really made me feel a lot more optimistic and hopeful, and reminded me, Lawrence Kremens, the great US historian of education, used to always talk about this pendulum swing in the United States history of education, of going forward and going back and going forward and going back. And hopefully each time we go forward a little more. And this is our chance to move forward in a big way.
Yeah.
So that's good.
And we look forward to you leading us in that direction, Dean Lamboy.
At least for the next 10 years. Until I'm too old to do anything. I wanted to say that everything you said resonated with me too, especially the focus on healing, the focus on the social and emotional well-being of students. But her words and her message also reminded me, and you and I pointed this out, Beverly, we said that's a challenge because we have a challenge in front of us and there is still a lot of work to do. For example, her words about having a thinking curriculum for all.
Yes.
That is a fight.
Yes.
That is a fight. And we need to keep doing the work to make sure that our students are aware of that. And we have to do that ourselves. We need to get engaged in our communities. As Nancy said, we need to collaborate with the DOE because that is a fight and we need to fight together. Another thing that she mentioned several times when she referenced the international rankings was how well other countries like Finland and Denmark do and what they do. And she said, she mentioned that in Finland, for example, and I'm quoting her words, deep pre-preparation of teachers.
Right.
What is the commitment of this country? What is the commitment of our state? What is the commitment of our college, our university, to this? To be able to attract those who are really passionate about this and use that as an incentive to make sure that they're very well prepared. So I got a lot out of the address, and it was a true pleasure for me to meet her. And as I said, very kind of her. So Professors Falk and Cardwell, thank you so very much for just holding my hand during this event. And to everyone, thank you for joining us. To our guests, it was an honor to have you. And I also want to say a special thank you to the Centennial Committee, especially to Professor Catherine Franklin and to Aminata Diop, who have been planning a series of events for over a year and a half. Thank you. You should feel very proud of yourselves, and have a good evening, everyone.